Grounded in the art and science of medicine, this podcast will help you to acquire knowledge, distill wisdom, and tune in to intuition, offering practical solutions to the complicated health questions that plague our modern times. While the medical model is broken and the conventions we have long held as true are crumbling, how do we make sense of it all? It starts one conversation at a time. Welcome to the Healthy Heathen Podcast. All right. Today I have with me a good friend of mine and an excellent teacher. His name is Gabriel Colella. He is the owner of Reflections Transformational Teaching and Consulting. He offers people a practical approach to inner peace. His interest in human potential and mindfulness has given him an in-depth understanding of our emotions and how we heal. He is a Reiki master and a vortex healing practitioner. His personal and professional practices have led him to create a system that he has termed the Law of Reflections. Using his reflections process, he works with clients both in person and remotely to improve relationships, solve stress and anxiety, and heal trauma. And all right, welcome, Gabe. How are you doing?
I'm doing well.
Thanks for joining us today. That's a wonderful bio you got there. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? There's a lot of stuff in there to unpack, I think.
Yeah, there are. There's some what I would call some proprietary terms in there as well.
Okay.
But yeah, I've been a Reiki master teacher for over 20 years and a vortex healing practitioner for a little over 8 years now. And vortex healing is a modality I use in combination with my Law of Reflections and reflections process work, because it's really great it's a form of energy work that's really great at getting to issues and physical issues too. And so sometimes that can help to move stuff or to give people the energy to look at the issues that are really bothering them. And so Law of Reflections is something, a term I came up with in grad school, finding that there was this one persistent idea that you call it ubiquitous, and a ubiquitous idea that came through all of those studies. And I noticed that I call it a law because it is consistent and it shows up not only in spirituality, but also in the world of physics and psychology in different forms. So the Law of Reflections is present in almost every world spiritual tradition, from the Mayans through Catholicism. You know, the Mayans have a term. Yeah. So the Mayans have a term called In Lakesh, which means I am another you. You know, Rastafarians say I and I, because they realize there's no separation between each other, that we're reflections of one another. The Hopi call it the Law of Mirrors. And so there's this concept has been presented in many different forms throughout history. In physics, it actually is the law of reflection, which is how light reflects. And we are essentially light because it has two properties, you know, wavelength and particle. So, and in psychology, we would call it projection. And so it's just, I like the term because it conveys the consistency of how this works, which I'll get into later. And the reflections process is the process of inquiry that I've developed to help people get to their core unconscious conditioning and identities, which actually influence behavior, choices, pretty much 95% of what we do. And we often wonder why we keep dating the same people or end up in the same type of relationships with our bosses or our parents or
jobs in general,
etc. Yeah. And so why we keep experiencing those same emotions and those same situations over and over again is in large part due to the unconscious conditioning we hold and that we've created as kids. So I guess just a short scientific background in that is like 95% of what we do is determined by the unconscious mind, or what we would call the habit mind, which is formed between the ages of 4 to 9. And so when we believe these
95%.
things to be true, yeah,
Wow.
the
That's
other
a lot.
5% is our personality and our logic and reasoning.
Okay. Yeah, I've always heard about, this. I never thought of it being 95% being unconscious. That's a lot.
Yeah, until we
So,
start
so your
to,
process is about working with this 95% that we're sort of just on autopilot with, basically.
yeah, we often don't understand what really drives us.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and what I found to be the crux of those driving patterns and issues, conditioning, whatever you want to call it, is identity, like I statements or me statements. Because
Mm-hmm.
as kids, we take everything personally. Everything's about me. Or
Right.
so when we form these beliefs as kids about ourselves, like I don't matter, for example, is a very common one that I've encountered with clients. And that story becomes the lens through which we see through.
Mm-hmm.
So how we see the world is how we get it back.
Nice.
And so what I mean by that is, like, if you're looking at the world through this lens of I don't matter, you're going to see the situations you encounter and the relationships in a particular way through that lens of I don't matter. So you're going to interpret your experience showing you that. And
Mm-hmm.
so there's often what I call associations that lead up to those identities. Like it might be start off with feeling stupid, right? So we can recognize feeling stupid and some of the shame that comes with that. But then
Right.
what does that lead to? Often, like, say, alone. So when I feel stupid, I also feel alone. And what does that mean about me? I don't matter. And that's kind of how it goes. But I'll talk about my process and how I uncover those things in a little bit too. But that sequence of associations and the identity are what kind of all lock that lens of perception into place.
Wow.
And we have many of those layers, kind of like an onion.
Mm-hmm. All right. So this law of reflections, you kind of came up with this term, or the
Mm-hmm.
reflections process. You came up with this process through your study. Now, I think a lot of people have heard of the law of attraction.
Mm-hmm.
Can you maybe explain a little bit of like the difference between maybe explain what the law of attraction is and how it might differ from this law of reflections?
Yeah. So law of attraction essentially is that we attract or manifest in our lives where we're vibrating at.
Okay.
And so how that operates is that, if we're vibrating at anger, we're going to attract experiences that can feed that, essentially.
Okay.
Where
Right.
the law of reflections comes in is in how you're seeing it and how you're labeling it or judging it. And that's where we get all the information to actually, for our own personal development, is through those labels and judgments. So I often tell people the 4 ways we give away our personal power are blaming, complaining, criticizing, and excuses. And
Mm.
so with complaining and blaming, we become a victim. But through our complaints or our criticisms of others or ourselves, we can begin to see what's under the surface that's actually being triggered, why we're judging and labeling. And that's 99% of the time because it reminds us of something we don't really like about ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
or you could call it our unresolved stuff. With the law of reflection, you could say there's no reflection without projection. So the moment you throw a label on something external is the moment that it has meaning. Otherwise, it just is, right? Like, that's a beautiful tree, right? You can't see it if it doesn't also exist in you. But when we start judging people like that stupid driver in front of us,
Right.
then that's an indication or a signpost start to turn the mirror back on ourselves.
That was an interesting example, yeah, because when you said a beautiful tree, I was like, yeah, of course. But as soon as you said the stupid driver in front of us, I was like, oh, I can identify with that.
Yeah, most people
Yeah,
can.
yeah. So at the root of this sort of law of reflection and the law of attraction, there seems to be that kind of a similar root. It's just that you're saying the law of reflections is something that you can work with more. And how do you influence what you're attracting at, what you're resonating at?
Mhm.
Is that kind of a fair
Yeah,
assumption?
and actually, with the reflections process, you can change that quote unquote point of attraction, because you're no longer view the lens is no longer pushing a button, so to speak.
Okay.
You're no longer viewing the world through that lens, so everything just is the way it is, and not seen through or colored by that lens through which you're seeing. And with the law of attraction, there's another main difference, is that part of their practice is to have people pivot away from what they're currently feeling to better feeling thoughts and
Hmm.
emotions. Whereas I have people, I say there's no way out of it but through it. So
Okay.
I have people sit with that uncomfortable emotion and actually look at where it leads.
Cool. So it sounds like, I mean, you're doing really deep personal growth work
Mhm.
with people. And what would you say, like, what are, I mean, you did mention your education and studying different world religions, but what would you say some of your influences are for this work? Are there people that we can read about, or books that you might recommend on this topic that would be good? I mean, we've touched on physics, we've touched on psychology, we've touched on religion.
Mhm.
It's a big and all-encompassing thing. So, I'm putting you on the
It
spot a
is.
little bit. Come up with the
Yeah,
but
there's
if
so
you
much
can't,
material.
fine.
Um,
Yeah.
and because I started um, I started meditation when I was 12 years old.
Wow.
Um, so I was very much into all of that stuff: metaphysics, personal development, human potential, um, and so I was uh, big into science in high school, as a young kid and throughout high school. And I started out college as an engineering major, um, and so I finished college with a degree in English, but I have a concentration in science, religion, and philosophy. Um, I also, during grad school, I worked at this holistic shop in Buffalo, New York, and we I worked there on the weekends, and I took
Mhm.
everything they had to offer. They had 3 walls of books. I read probably at least 50% of those. I took reflexology classes, astrology, past life regression, gemstones and crystals, like everything they had to offer. I just devoured it. Um, and shortly after grad school, I studied with Tawadakwe, a Native American elder of the Turtle Clan on the Tuscarora
Mhm.
Nation. I studied with him
Mhm.
for 7 years. So what I currently do is a kind of conglomeration of everything I've studied, both academically and non-traditionally, up until now.
Yeah. So you've really
And
pulled together so many different pieces, huh?
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and in English, part of what I looked at, or a big part of my studies, were archetypes and symbolism, and uncovering um, meaning and stories, and how stories really play a role in being human,
Mhm.
and why we formulate stories, because they have meaning for us, and that often translates to how we create personal meaning as well.
Mhm. All right, so you told us a little bit about your journey, and there's a lot going on now with, like, kind of the connection between spirituality and science. Is there anything that you want to say about that? That sounds like you've kind of have a background in both.
Hmm.
Um, I find that that's a really interesting sort of coming together that's kind of sort of been happening for the past, well, maybe 40, 50 years, where, the development of quantum physics and certain other aspects of science have really come full circle around with connecting back with spirituality.
Mhm.
So anything you might want to mention about that?
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap, and there are some traps along the way too, where people get sidetracked or lost, and I'll
Hmm.
hopefully come back to those. But there's a lot with perception and how
Hmm.
that works, and um, neural science as well, and epigenetics. So epigenetics is, to oversimplify, like it's the emotional layer of our DNA, the stuff we inherit from our ancestors, about, you could say, 7 generations on each side.
Wow,
They've
that's
recently
cool.
found some people that have epigenetic markers from the Holocaust, and they can trace those back pretty
Wow, they can
accurately.
actually trace that in the genetic
Yeah, in the
expression.
epigenetics.
The
Um,
epigenetics. And epigenetics, could you define that? That's the sort of the expression of the genes. Is that what that means?
yeah, it's more of the expression, and so
Hmm.
that's what we can work with, actually, and that's what part of my work gets to, is that expression, which we inherit from our ancestors, partly by modeling and taking after our parents, but because they
Right.
inherited their patterns and conditioning from their parents and so on. And we start modeling that in the womb. We hear it, we inherit it epigenetically, and then it's reinforced through our childhood experiences. It kind of just needs a particular moment when we make a belief true, because kids also have what I call forever thinking. We think in terms of forever. So when we feel something deeply, it feels like it's going to last forever. And so when we
Right.
believe a belief that we think is true about ourselves, that's true forever until adulthood, when we begin to question some of those things and how they're serving
Mhm.
us. The other part of science and spirituality. um,
Hey, before we move on, I have another question about genetics. Uh, this, yeah, I've been looking into this. This is really interesting. So we're sort of born with our genetic material, and it seems like genes can be we could be susceptible to certain things, positive or negative, and that genes can be turned on and turned off.
mhm.
Um, is that is that what you're talking about with epigenetics? Like epigenetics would be the turning on and turning off of genes, the gene expression. So that's what I've been learning, was just that we're born with a certain set of genes, which, we get its genetic material, its DNA from our parents. A lot of people have a fatalistic look at it, like, well, you can't do anything about it. But when you listen to, um, Bruce Lipton or Joe Dispenza, they talk a lot about, how we have the control basically in our lives of how those genes get expressed. So, you know, you could have siblings that are predisposed to a certain type of disease, and maybe one of them gets it and one of them doesn't. And why is that? What turned that on and off? Um, I just find that really fascinating, and it kind of plays in with what you're saying about how your law of reflections, the reflections process, kind of works with these deep, you know, uh, very beginning perceptions of ourself, who we are, and how even those things can affect our genetics.
Yeah, so we're not necessarily working directly with genetics, but the expression of it. And in essence, you could say your mental, emotional tendencies are are what come in with that. And so you're kind of predisposed to that type of leaning or that tendency, and all it really needs is just a moment, when you believe it's true.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, and I think that's probably what gene expression is about. It's like, if you're going to start meditating and taking care of yourself, I think you could really train your body's response to get out of certain um, expressions. You know, I mean, a lot of time, I think what I see is that people are going through a very stressful period of life. And of course, that's when something happens, an illness comes on, the genetic expression that maybe they were susceptible to didn't get turned on until they were going through a situation where they couldn't handle the stress or an environmental toxin, or, the stress could be, the grief from a death of a loved one, or, as simple as someone, their kids going away to college, it doesn't have to be that dramatic, but, yeah. So it's interesting, you had mentioned perception too. I'm interested to hear more about how you work with perception. And then I have a couple other questions, but why don't you tackle that first?
All right. Well, then part of it involves looking at the nature of consciousness itself. And so how does it function, right? So consciousness is reflective. But there, like I said, there's no reflection without projection until we provide the label and the meaning. And so when we look at perception, right, after we form these beliefs about ourselves as kids, we have all these lenses through which we're looking through regarding our experience of the world. And so if we're looking, say, we'll come back to the I don't matter story, right? If you're looking at the world through the lens of I don't matter, you're going to see that wherever you go. So partly because kids are in that place of magical thinking too, which is also, it's one of the parts of spiritual bypassing, which is often how we think that we're more omnipotent than we actually are, right? So we think like, oh, I saw 2 crows today. What does that mean for me, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean anything. It could just be that they're 2 crows, right? So, and oftentimes it is just 2 crows, but we want to feel that the universe is showing us something or giving us a sign, and it's not necessarily. But that's part of that holdover from childhood, that type of magical thinking where we see the world in a particular way and we get it back and we think that our experience is confirming our belief. So because we see the world through the lens of I don't matter, that's how we, our relationships are going to show us that, our job is going to show us that in different ways. It'll show up all over the place because you'll feel the same way. And so that's what is really important, is that, and comes back to the law of reflections, is that emotion is a reflection of mind in the body. We can use our emotional landscape to help cause of our upsets are, the things that trigger us or, annoy us, etc.
You froze there
And
for a second. I wonder if you could just repeat that last thing.
Yeah, so with perception, if we're seeing the world through that lens of I don't matter, it's going to show up everywhere. And because we're looking for it, whether it's conscious or unconscious, we're looking for it. And so what that does, because it shows up more often, which is frequency illusion, it apparently shows up more often.
You can explain that? Frequency illusion? Is that what you said?
Frequency illusion. There's 2 components to magical thinking. One is called frequency illusion. So because we're looking for it, it shows up more often. And because it shows up more often, the next part is confirmation bias. It confirms what we already think about the situation or the meaning that it has.
It's kind of like when you or somebody you know gets a new car, and then you start noticing that car everywhere. How many people have the same car? It's because you're looking for it, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Or you learn a new word that you never heard of before, and then within the next 3 days you hear it 3 more times.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's on your radar now, and you see it everywhere you go. And that's part of, so magical thinking is composed of both confirmation bias and frequency illusion. And there's nothing wrong with it. We tend to do it as adults, but it's one of those perceptual traps that we fall into, right?
Yeah.
But what can help you to kind of find your way we often get lost in what I call the surface stuff, like how we feel. Like we might feel angry. We recognize anger, but we don't know what's underneath that. Or we
Okay.
recognize shame, or we recognize sadness, but we don't usually inquire any further about it. Like, oh, I feel sad, right?
Hmm.
I feel sad about this thing happening, but it's really not about the thing that's happening. It's because it's reminding you of something you think about yourself usually. Like, I don't matter.
Yeah.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit about like what kind of signs do matter. Like there are. It can get really confusing when you think about law of attraction, law of reflection, and you're creating your sort of reality and seeing things that you want to see. Like sometimes there are signs, right? How do you kind of differentiate? Is that kind of part of your work? Yeah.
Well, a lot of time, what I would call signs, I would say is more along the lines of synchronicity. Synchronicity
Hmm.
exists. Like
Right.
you were thinking about that friend who you haven't seen in 3 years, and all of a sudden they call you, right?
Hmm.
Like that's synchronicity.
That's
But
working on some other level.
yeah,
Yeah.
but when we are like every day, we see animals. Like a lot of people get into very much into animal symbolism, and
Hmm.
like I saw a hawk twice today. What does that mean? What visionary guidance am I going to get?
Hmm.
And it's usually about us. We want something to give us direction,
Hmm.
because we're used to looking externally for our answers, when really most of our answers are internal. And if we
Gotcha.
just look at, so oftentimes what people get caught up in is the desire for meaning or guidance. They want things to mean something, so they look up the meanings and they look at what part of that meaning resonates with me, and
Hmm.
now that message is for me. So, and that's part of how we get lost in that. But synchronicity definitely occurs, and it's without even trying, really. It's just noticing. Um, so oftentimes people get caught up in looking for those signs and looking for those meanings, and of course they're going to find them because they're looking for them.
Hmm.
So, and they're going to look for what most resonates with them and what's going on right now. And the brain's very good at making connections like that, but
Right.
it's not always the truth of what's happening. And so I
Your
usually
reflections
advise people.
process really
What's
goes
that?
deeper. Your reflections
Yeah,
process really goes deeper.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I often advise people to look at why they're seeking meaning in the first place. Like, why do you want guidance or direction or meaning? And
Mhm.
that will give you more answers as to what's really underneath that desire.
Very cool. Very cool. All right. You had mentioned the term, I don't know if everybody's familiar with this, spiritual bypassing. Um,
Yes.
that's a good one. Let's talk about that for a minute.
Spiritual bypassing is using spiritual ideas or principles to bypass unresolved issues, um, uncomfortable feelings,
Hmm.
and unresolved trauma. And so, magical thinking is one of those ways that we bypass spiritually, because we're predisposed to avoid pain, whether it's physical pain or emotional pain. And so when we have uncomfortable feelings come up, we often use these certain ways of bypassing those uncomfortable feelings. And
Hmm.
often, especially in American culture, we have what's called anger phobia. We're afraid of anger because
Okay.
it's often expressed violently or aggressively, but
Right.
when anger is expressed cleanly, it has a different impact, different effect.
Right. Right.
Um, we have false transcendence, like, oh, I've worked on that, or I'm past that
These are,
now.
this is great. There's like all these terms for things that sort of are really tricky to figure out, but you're putting some labels on them that make it kind of easier to talk about, maybe easier to work with, like magical
Mhm.
thinking, false transcendence, spiritual bypassing. These
Yeah,
are these are good terms for people that are on the spiritual path, that are trying to work through this stuff. It probably fell into a lot of these holes, you know.
yeah. There's a lot of people like, you're bringing down my vibe. Well, it's not all about high vibes. It's there's much more to it than that. And if you try to
If only. Yeah.
it's like the whole positive thinking movement. When some
Yeah.
of those positive thinking gurus were interviewed, they said they just wrote the book basically to help them get over their own negative thinking. And I'm more for balanced thinking. Because if you try to stay positive, the world's going to bring events to bring you back down to balance, to humility. It seeks equilibrium.
Right. Right.
Right? So trying to stay
That's a
high
tough one.
vibe
I
and
think that's a tough one. That's a tough one for people. There's a lot of people that are dealing with, stuff that they really don't know how to deal with, and they really think they have to have a positive attitude.
yeah.
Or they think that's the answer because it's kind of been put out there in a very trite way. The whole
Hmm.
self-help movement. I think that,
Yeah.
kind of got started off with that, Stuart Smalley,
Yeah. And they can
and
also pass blame, like, you're to blame for your own health issues and all this stuff in your life. And, you know, it's there partly because of how you see the world, but you're not to blame,
right.
for whatever you're going through, for your experience.
That's a
It's
big
just,
one. That's a
yeah.
big one. I think that turns people off to sort of this line of thinking is like, yeah, I've been struggling, if someone's been struggling with a health issue for a long time and then they get into this and it makes it sound like they're being blamed for their own, thing. It's this is a huge kind of turn off. How do you work with that with people?
Well, you are responsible for what you think and feel, but not
Right.
for how your experience unfolds. We don't know. That's the mystery, right? We don't,
Nice.
that's not up to us. And even the notion that we create our own reality is somewhat skewed. And in fact, it gives us more omnipotence than we actually have.
Hmm.
And we do participate in how our experience unfolds, especially through our attitude about that experience.
Yeah.
But we can't determine how it unfolds or the
Yeah.
way in which the experience comes to us.
Right. Right on. I think that's, a lot in the new age movement. You see people really buying into this, hook, line, and sinker about, we create our own reality. It's kind of on you.
Hmm.
Um, and there's definitely some sort of judgment to it. I think sometimes in um, a lack of a little bit more depth of understanding about how these concepts actually work. So it
Yeah.
sounds like, you're really, you know, I like what you're saying and how your approach is like kind of, yeah, these things are true to a certain extent, but there's also, this other deeper part. It's not so simple. It's not so black and white, you
Hmm.
know, um, there's a balance. And I like what you said about creating your own reality and that, we kind of participate in creating
Of
our own
course.
reality. And there's some truth to that, but there's things that are out of our control and there's things that influence our reality, and there's partly our experience of being here on earth, and we just have to experience it you
Hmm.
know
And the other part is people often label emotions as positive or negative, and they want to stay in the positive emotions. But emotions are
Gotcha.
just emotions. It's our judgment that makes them positive or negative. Like anger is just anger, love is just love, you know, and happiness is just happiness. They're just different emotions on the spectrum, and they're not positive or negative, but they all have information for us.
Right. Right on. All right, so you had mentioned trauma earlier, that you do have some experience working with trauma. Is that what you're
Hmm.
saying?
Absolutely.
uh, that's a big one. Do you have any sort of examples or stories that you can share? Because trauma is something that I think our society really struggles with how to address.
Yeah.
And there are some good books out there. Thinking of Gabor Mate and Vanderkirk. Um, The Body Keeps the Score, and In the Realm of Hungry Ghosts by Mate. And but it's something that our society really struggles with. Is it what can you bring to that part of the conversation?
Well,
What your process bring?
yeah, I'll kind of address that in two parts. The first is I'll try to address trauma in the most simple way possible, in that it comes from separation, right? The belief that we're separate from everyone and everything else. And trauma, we often look at it as kind of the magnitude of the trauma, right? Like we look at, we try to, people tend to put, say, like sexual abuse, or, physical abuse in like a particular category of trauma. But I think the original trauma is feeling that we're separate, and it's all those little identities we make as kids, like I don't matter, or I don't belong here, and those are all ways that we see ourselves as separate. So all those lenses through which we're seeing through are different ways that we see ourselves as separate from all that is. And that's kind of the original trauma. I call what the things I get to with my process, I call them primordial stories of separation consciousness. In that these are stories where we believe we're separate, and they're kind of like the original traumas. And oftentimes, when we form those beliefs, the magnitude of the emotion we feel when those are formed is part of the traumatic experience. And we often experience that same magnitude over and over again when we feel that same emotion. Mm-hmm. And so we may have something, it may have just been that, for example, I had a client who she made up the story, I don't matter, because her dad had been gone at work for like 12, 14 hours. He came home, said hi to her mom, and walked past her and went to the bedroom and laid down. Now, he didn't mean to do anything to her, but in that moment, she felt like I don't matter, right? And so that carried with her into her adult life until we worked through it. And so that's a trauma, right? That belief that I don't matter to my dad. And so that was part of their relationship for a long time as well. Mm-hmm. Whereas I had another client who was, her father was sexually abusive, and she brought she and her brother to a hotel to be abused by his friends as well. And they shared all their children in a hotel room. And that, we would say, that is hugely traumatic. And it was, but it's not something that she couldn't work through or see from another way. And we did work through that with lots of tears and Kleenex, of course. And those things, but like I said, there's no way out of it but through it. So part of it is actually going through that pain to see what is in there, and and what the belief is that's actually holding that core belief, the core identity, and to realize that that's not who you really are. Then that the whole thing shifts. You're no longer seeing from that traumatized perspective anymore, that traumatized lens, and it's like smoothing that lens out. Mm-hmm. Right? There's not a button to push anymore. And so that's part of where we begin to heal from trauma, is getting at the core of where that started and how it arose. And that's what my process of inquiry does. The reflections process is, it's a series of questions that have been designed to kind of to drill into the core of what's holding everything in place. And most of it's held in place by identity, because it's just an idea of who we are, and as a separate person. And mm-hmm. So as we begin to peel away these, all identities are false. They're not who we really are. They're little parts of a much larger picture. And so as we peel away those layers and become more whole within ourselves, then there's less separation, and there's less agitation in one's system. There's less, mental and emotional mm-hmm. noise, and you're able to be in your body and comfortable with yourself. And essentially it is about loving yourself, all those disowned parts.
Mm-hmm. So your work is really helping people to become more whole.
Mm-hmm. and to love
Nice.
who they are as they are.
So if all IDs are false to a certain extent, what are people left with what does a more whole person look like?
Um, a more whole person looks more like a more balanced person,
Hmm.
someone who can be calm in the middle of the storm. And I call it ecstatic process, being
Hmm.
excited about being calm.
Being excited about being calm. I like
Yeah.
that.
And oftentimes clients will get almost to that place and then they'll be like, this is boring. And we look at what's not okay with boredom, because
Okay.
that's the real issue at hand at that point in time.
And what about well, I feel like yeah, I've gotten to that place. And as soon as that happens, maybe not as soon as that happens, but then something will inevitably pop up and show me that I'm not quite as on the level that I thought I was at. Like right now we're sort of still in the middle of this pandemic, and it's been triggering a lot of things for a lot of different people. And it's definitely had some things that have triggered me pretty
Mhm.
intensely. Um, so I'm not as balanced as I thought, and I've done some work on different things. And um, how does that work? You get somebody to a certain place, and then they're never triggered again, or or they just have the tools to deal with it. How does that work?
A little bit of both. They're not triggered by the same thing again in the same way. It's kind of like learning Santa Claus isn't real. You can't
Mm-hmm.
go back to believing that he is. And so once you work through an identity or a story, um, you can't go back to seeing it the same way ever again, or the
Right.
experience that created it.
Right.
And so moving forward to now and the things that we get triggered by, it's like you've worked through that story and neutralized the emotional charge that's in there, and you notice that you're triggered by something else. And oftentimes we think that it's that thing we just worked through,
Mm-hmm.
because I call it our family tree of stories, because we inherit it from our families. But it is like a tree, in that when you notice that something you've already worked on is being triggered, it's a really good indicator that there's something deeper, because it's all connected. And so that something deeper is giving a little energy or a little juice to what you've already worked on. And because
Mm-hmm.
you've made space in yourself from working on that, space likes to be filled. So it makes space for deeper stuff to arise. And the rabbit
Right.
hole is never ending.
Yeah.
So you work on one layer and you now have the capacity to work on what's deeper.
Yeah. We often have this thinking that, oh, if I could just work through this one issue, then my life will be XYZ perfect. I'll be, on the level with these other people that I see that look so successful or
Hmm.
happy. But my experience is exactly what you just said, is like I might work through that issue and then almost be disappointed to realize that, while that was a great success in working through some sort of major hurdle in life, um, and in my internal tree, that within a short period of time, you kind of glow in the wind for a little while. And then after a while, you're kind of back to where you started with a different thing.
Hmm.
I think that's kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, it's very much like a spiral. You just now see it from a new perspective, or
Yeah.
if it's the same thing, you see it from a new perspective. And it's I got I'm trying to find the words for it. Um, it's not just seeing it from a new perspective, but because you've made space, there's room for deeper stuff to arise and for you to address that.
Hmm.
Um, but we get caught in the light show, so to speak, right? We get
Hmm.
caught in all the shiny stuff out here, and the stuff or the low hanging fruit, the stuff that's easy for us to recognize.
Okay.
So things that I would call those surface stories. And surface stories, um, some examples of those would be like, not enough, or I'm worthless. Things like that. We recognize the not enoughs and the worthless and the letdown, but we
But they're
don't.
sort of distractions from sort of the deeper well of what's really going on.
Yeah. And part of that is because everything wants to live. including our identities or stories. And those
Mhm.
identities and stories get fed through our emotional energy. And if we see them for what they are, they can't get fed in the same way anymore. And that's part
That's
of what
really
my
interesting.
process does, is to help people see those stories for what they are, or to move through the layers of kind of illusion that we've set up for ourselves.
It's kind of
And
like, our fears, kind of have like a fuel to them,
mhm,
you know. And if you can work through some of that, you take away the fuel, you realize, yeah, that what was sort of a boogeyman is really just sort of there's nothing there.
mhm. And often, as we like, sometimes when I work with clients, we'll find that the story itself starts creating a lot of noise, so to speak. And what I mean by that is that it makes the mind overactive with lots of chatter. Or I often don't do this work with people's kids around, because kids are tuned into your patterns and conditioning. And the few times I have, like, as soon as we get close to what it actually is, like, all of a sudden their kid will be all over them, or their pet will walk across the keyboard, and the cat, and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
the video conference will turn off, like, right at that precise moment. Um, in fact, a really
So
fun example,
these sort of go ahead.
a fun
Sorry.
example of that was when I was working with my Native American teacher, um, who was out in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the Tuscarora Reservation. We were helping a person get to one of their stories, and at the precise moment he was about to name what it was, there was this big knock on the door, like, boom, boom, boom. We need all of you to come out of here right now. And we're like, what's going on? We open the door and we see all these fully armed sheriffs in the doorway. And so they come with us, and
Oh
then we
my
come
god.
out of the classroom, and there's probably like 6 or 7 sheriffs armed with shotguns and Kevlar vests.
What?
Yeah.
Oh my god.
And we were all standing out there, and they looked at all of us, and they were looking for an escaped inmate. But it just so happened it was right at that precise moment when he was
Yeah,
about to
yeah.
name the story that was, the cause. And
Yeah, I really I can identify with this. It's interesting to think that these things have sort of a life of their own.
mhm,
And even taking it a little bit more to a spiritual philosophical level, like when people talk about evil, good and evil, and then they say that, well, good, and the lightness and God, like those are really the only things that exist fully in true reality. But these other things exist because they're being fed. They're being fed by our fears, but they don't really have a life of their own. And I think that the analogy kind of with the spiritual realm and psychological and even a physical realm and how these things manifest is really interesting because definitely know what you're talking about. Definitely have had the experience of having the kids, definitely get louder when you're at an important point. It's kind of a little bit like Murphy's Law with that.
mhm. Oh,
And
yeah, they pick up on it unconsciously too. Is that
yeah,
our unconscious mind is way more powerful than we often realize. Just
yeah.
to put it in perspective, um, your unconscious mind can process about 20 million bits of information per second, whereas
Okay.
your conscious mind can process about 40 bits of information per second.
Wow.
So the unconscious mind has 500,000 times the processing power of the conscious mind. So if you think about that in and of itself, instant facial recognition, instant like energy recognition, you can see, like, it can tell what's going to get it fed, so to speak.
It's funny. This is a really silly example, but I used to work at a group home, and they really loved watching Jeopardy every night. And so I would sit down with them and watch it. And because it was in such a relaxed place, I would just hear the answers bubbling up, and I would just blurt them out. And everybody was like so impressed. But it was because I was so relaxed. Whenever I
Mhm.
tried to do it, I couldn't come up with the answers, and or I could come up with maybe 1/10 or 2/10 of the answers that I would do if I was just in this very relaxed place. The answers would just kind of come to me, somewhere. And I used to think about that, like somewhere there's like a vast data bank that that was being searched instantaneously and popping up the answer. It's not something I could have consciously done. And I just find that so fascinating. And it's interesting. I've never heard what you just said. That's really fascinating about how the unconscious mind can process so quickly. It's like a supercomputer, like a human supercomputer that's just, you know,
Yeah.
uh, I don't know how it relates to actual computers as far as processing, but it sounds like it's a lot.
Well, it runs on a pretty basic program, which are those identities, you know, because it just looks to get those things fed, because that's what we believe to be true as kids, and it's true forever until later. But you really brought up some interesting points about trying and about picking up on stuff in the field. And you asked about books earlier, and Rupert Sheldrake has an interesting information about what he calls morphic fields, that all this information exists in the quanta, so to speak, in these different fields, like the field of medicine, the field of psychology, and there's those are different fields of consciousness within the one field of consciousness, and you can pick up on those when you're in a relaxed state. But we're often not in a relaxed state. We're not in that ecstatic process of being excited about being calm, because
Right.
we're in effect trying, and we're so caught up in trying to do things, because when we try, we're often engaging in a form of struggle of some sort, or resistance. And it's that struggle or resistance, that's how we get used to engaging life in those ways, with struggle, with resistance, with
Hmm.
resentment, with whatever you want to put in there. However you get used to engaging life in your way. Some people engage life with underlying anger, and anger, the roots of anger 99% of the time are in feeling helpless. And we
Hmm.
go straight from helpless to anger in a heartbeat, or less than a heartbeat, because we don't like feeling helpless. It feels powerless. But with anger, we can do stuff, right?
Right.
We can throw something, we can get something done. It gives us a vast amount of energy. But how we express that anger is often, can be contrary to what we're trying to achieve. So if we express
Yeah.
it aggressively or violently, it doesn't meet the ends to which we're trying to go, or where we're trying to go. But if we find a way to express it compassionately, um, or express it constructively, then we can actually do something with that, and not let the anger drive us, but use the energy from that to see what we want, and how we want to do that.
Yeah, I think it's really, this whole thing is really interesting, and like we were talking about a minute ago, tapping into the subconscious. And I have another example. Like I think sports is also a good example. I use the example of Jeopardy, and sort of, if I'm alone or with people that I feel really comfortable with, then I could just come up with answers. But if I'm trying, like there's been times that I thought I was like, wow, I'm really good at this. I want to impress somebody, and like I can't come up with the answers. And the same thing too, like say shooting hoops, basketball. You know, I could be in just shooting hoops by myself, and every once in a while, I'll just get into a zone, and I could really just kind of hit everything. It's like this real connection with the mind, body, um, and I could do that much more consistently if I'm just practicing by myself. But if you get into around other people, it adds a whole nother level of awareness. Like there's other people here, so there's like, it brings in different identities, it brings in different awarenesses, like there's other people watching. And that's why I think, like when you think about like some of the high level athletes, and how, under the pressure of, the not only playing against the other team, but having the intensity of this fans right there, all watching, either rooting for you or rooting against you, and it doesn't matter probably either way. Even rooting for you could probably be really intense because you're afraid to fail. But when you see someone like Tom Brady or Michael Jordan, and how they can really just tap into this zone, this unconscious zone, how Michael Jordan did that over and over and over again. I think that's what made him special and set him apart.
Yeah, well, part of it's having that singular focus, right? Like, where's your attention going?
Right.
And when we're really present, we have a singular focus. And but often in relationships and conversations, people are thinking about how to respond to what the other person's saying instead of really listening, or they're thinking about what the other person's thinking about them instead of what they're actually saying. Things like that often keep us from being present and focused on what's happening. And that's one of the primary things too, is we often mistake what we think is happening for what is really happening.
Mhm.
A great example I find is, have you ever been, at a stoplight in your car and had a car pull up next to you at the stoplight and feel like you're moving backward?
Yeah.
So are you really moving backward? No, but it sure feels like it. And that's what happens with our emotions too, is we get so caught up in what we think is happening, like say through the
Right.
lens of I don't matter, like this, somehow we're feeling like we don't matter to this person or to ourselves. But that's not what's really happening.
Right.
And it could just be the way someone said something or the way something unfolds, and that's how we interpreted it.
Yeah, it's tricky to figure out, well, what is it really happening or is it not really happening? Is this my filter or is this something that needs to be addressed in reality, you know? It's tough. Those are the hard parts. Sounds like your process really helps to differentiate these little subtle differences.
Yeah. And so I hope to help. Part of what my process gives people is that ability to discern. Um, and part of that ability to discern really comes from developing one's ability to navigate their emotional landscape. And that means getting in touch with all those feelings, the comfortable ones and the uncomfortable ones. And so eventually I help people to get comfortable with feeling uncomfortable, because that's where the real learning takes place, and that's where we can begin to train ourselves in what's called teleological thinking, which is seeing things. It's a biological term for when butterflies transform, or caterpillars transform into butterflies, right?
Hmm.
And but what happens in the middle is important. They and that's the point at which you can begin to say, what is this showing me? How is this on the way rather than in the way, or educational rather than obstructional?
It's great stuff, Gabe. I really like it. For people that might be interested in working with you, do you have a website or an email or a phone number you want to give out? I think we're getting close to the end of our time here.
Yeah.
Uh,
My website is lawofreflections.com.
okay.
My email is Gabriel at lawofreflections.com. And my phone number is 716-308-8962.
Well, there you go. We got all three things there.
Yeah.
Any
And
last
so,
words you want to share?
yeah, one of the most important takeaways is that it's not necessarily what you're doing, but how you're doing it. And that goes for everything from how you wash the dishes to how you walk down the sidewalk. So do you complain the whole time you're washing the dishes? If so, that's a good sign to inquire. Do you judge people while you're walking down the sidewalk? Because that's how you judge yourself. It's how you do, right? So some people say how you do anything is how you do everything. And so it's more important in the how rather than the what.
That's a great, practical step just to kind of leave people with here. Yeah, thank you so much for joining today, and really appreciate you coming on. I've learned a lot, and it's really fascinating work that you do. And thank you
Yeah.
so much.
All right. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.